There was once a serpent slithering through the reeds near the banks of a sacred river. And as he came around the bend, he heard some voices in the green clearing. And he slithered out of the reeds, drawn, sort of magnetized by these voices. And he saw, to his astonishment, Shiva and Shakti. And Shakti was asking Shiva to expand for her on the knowledge of yoga. For Shiva to tell her about the art of yoga, the contemplation of yoga, and the promise of yoga. That is what yoga can sort of, what kind of meaning it can imbue to experience through its practice. So this serpent, whose name was Ananta, or Anantashesha, coiled up in the reeds and listened as intently as he could. Excuse me, you might hear me better now. I had my microphone on the floor. Is that better? So, to everything that Shakti had to say, and of course, that Shiva had to say, and the irony, of course, is that Shakti is the intelligence behind yoga practice. So everything that Shiva has to say, Shakti already knows. But she delights in seeing her creative energy spreading itself out through the space of his consciousness. And so she asks him to be the voice of that intelligence, and so that she can lean back against the tree in this beautiful sylvan glade and just listen to him sort of rhapsodize, right? So Anantashesha downloads all of the information that he can. He absorbs everything. He's totally wrapped in attention as he listens to this dialogue, or I guess it's mostly a monologue. And when Shiva finally finishes, Anantashesha tries to slither off. But Shiva, of course, is omniscient. And so he knew that Anantashesha was there the whole time, because Shiva represents the space of consciousness that holds everything, right? So he's conscious of Anantashesha being there. He is Anantashesha's consciousness. He was conscious of Anantashesha listening as Anantashesha's listening, conscious of him telling as he's telling, conscious even of Shakti listening to what he's saying. So Shiva reaches over and plucks this serpent out of the reeds and holds him up to his face and tells him that he owes some tuition for all of the intuition that he just received. Right? And his tuition, according to an old Indian tradition, the teacher gets to tell the student what's owed after the teaching has been given. And he tells Anantashesha that he's to incarnate into the human realm and share the wisdom that he's received with humanity. Okay? And Anantashesha graciously, of course, agrees to do this. And so he's born into a human womb, and he slides down the birth canal on the day of his birth into his mother's unsuspecting hands. She lifts him up, to see her beautiful new baby, and finds, to her great horror, a creature that is human from the waist to the crown of the head, but has a serpent's tail that's sort of coiled and wriggling in the air, and has a giant serpent's hood that, and if that wasn't bad enough, that is itself made up of 1,000 other serpent heads that are all singing in different languages, right? And she shrieks and she throws this poor creature from her hands, and he falls to the earth, stands up, turns, bows, salutes his mother, and then slithers off and writes the Yoga Sutra, okay? And in fact, this story is often told about how Patanjali got his name, because it literally means fallen from the hands, Patanjali. And so Patanjali is said to be an avatar of Anantashesha, who received the wisdom of yoga directly from this discourse between Shiva and Shakti. And Patanjali is described in a verse that is from the Bhoja Vritti, which is a 12th century commentary on the Yoga Sutra, okay? But now notice, this commentary is probably around, somewhere between 800 and 1200 years older than the Yoga Sutra itself, right? I think probably more like 1200 years older. And this commentary is also emerging in a context where a sort of tantric Shaivism is beginning to really spread through India. Okay, so keep that in mind. But at the beginning of this commentary, called the Bhoja Vritti, because it's written by King Bhoja, the following verse is given. Abahu purushakaram shankachakrasi dharinam sahasra shirasam shvetam pranamami patanjalim. Right? And what this verse, it's a salutation to Patanjali, and it describes Patanjali as being an amalgam of serpent and human forms. That is, it describes him as having a human form from the waist to the crown of the head, but having a coiled serpent's tail and having a cobra's hood, which is itself made up of 1,000 other serpent heads. Okay? Now this verse, it's the second half of the Ashtanga Invocation. It's also, it's chanted in many other traditions. The Iyengar yogis chant this verse, and it's a very common verse to chant before doing Hatha Yoga practices, right? Because the verse represents what's called a dhyana shloka. A dhyana shloka is an aid for meditation. And what a dhyana shloka does is it gives you a particular image, a sacred image that you contemplate in your meditation. But the dhyana shloka, the image that's given in the shloka, is not meant just to be held before the eye of the mind. That is, it's not that you just picture this object outside of you and focus your attention on it. That's not it. It's rather that you install the image that's described into your embodied awareness, into your proprioceptive awareness, so that you literally feel yourself as embodying that sacred form. Okay? And that kind of meditation is central to tantric practice generally. Okay? In tantric yoga, if you want to meditate on a particular deity or on the energy that the deity represents, right? On the particular dimension of reality or the mandala of energy that's represented by that deity form, you have to first embody it. You have to evoke that energy in yourself. You have to make your subtle body in some sense manifest that particular form, then you contemplate it. Do you see? Okay? Now, Ashtanga Vinyasa is a tantrasized form of Hatha Yoga. okay? And as such, right, it, is oriented toward this very same idea of meditation. Okay? So the whole practice is meant to be an embodied meditation on whatever is represented by that amalgam of serpent and human forms that is Patanjali. Are you with me? In other words, let me say it more simply. When you practice Ashtanga, you're supposed to install that image of Patanjali in your own proprioceptive awareness. Right? Now, that might sound outrageous, and, well, it is. And let's talk about what it means, because it's very easily misunderstood what that means, okay? And if you understand what it is, you realize that it's something very palpable, very visceral, very tangible, right? It's something, and tantric practices are all like this, that although they may evoke very high sophisticated and even esoteric philosophical ideas, the practices themselves are meant to bring those ideas straight down to immediate experience, so that the idea that's represented can be physically embodied, right? And that even your awareness of physically embodying that is not something terribly elusive. That is, if you're doing it, you know that you're doing it, because the signs are super vivid, okay? So let's talk about what that image of Patanjali means, okay? Well, those two serpent elements, the hood and the tail, represent the two basic energies that we work with in Hatha Yoga, okay? These are the energies that we often refer to as prana and apana. Okay? Prana and apana are both types of prana. It's just a confusing fact that the general word, the category of prana is also used for a subset of that called prana. But so be it, right? Prana is the expansive energy. It's the energy. Prana literally means the breath that moves forth. Okay? And so it's the breath that reaches. It's the breath that expands. Physiologically, it's associated with reaching, literally reaching and even drawing nourishment in, right? Whereas apana literally means the breath that moves down, okay? And physiologically, it's associated with removing excess from the body. So it's responsible for the peristaltic movement of the gut. It's responsible for the contractions of the womb in the birthing process, right? It's responsible for the release of the soft palate that allows you to let go, to soften your attachments to the objects of thought, and to let those things also dissolve back into the emptiness, right? So notice that one of these pranas is associated with, well, inspiration, drawing in, inhaling. That's prana. And as we inhale, the heart expands, and that's that sort of reaching aspect, and the arms might even reach up, etc. And the imagination is activated by the pranic force, as is captured by that polysemous word, inspiration, right? Which can mean both to inhale and to have one's imagination activated and inspired. And the aponic force, is then associated with dissolution. So one of them is associated with creation, with form. The other one with dissolution, with emptiness, right? And we find that this movement between drawing things in and releasing things out is essential to and participated in by every form of life. From single-celled organisms, bacteria do it, right? Worms do it. Rodents do it. Pets do it. Whales do it. People do it. All living organisms are engaged in this process of drawing in and releasing out. We call it breathing, right? There's one dimension of breathing, which is sort of respiration, like the exchange of gases in and out of the lungs. But we know also that every cell in the human body, every human cell, but also every non-human cell that's living, is also engaged in the same process, right? In its own sort of microcosmic environment. It's also doing this thing of bringing things in and releasing things out, right? Everything, all life participates in that process. You might even say that it's in some sense definitive of life, right? Okay, so we have this image of Patanjali with what is distinctly human about him. Let's say, his sort of, the belly, maybe the pelvis, almost the pelvis, the heart, and the head, right, are all represented in human form, being suspended between these two movements of creation and dissolution. Okay? It's sometimes said, it doesn't say this in the Ashtanga Invocation, but it's said elsewhere, many, many, many places, that those serpent heads that make up Patanjali's hood are all singing in different languages. And they represent the infinite diversity of perspectives that Patanjali might take on any given moment of his experience. Okay? Because prana crystallizes into thought. So all of your conceptual frameworks are themselves manifestations of prana. Right? Manifestations that are actually somewhat, dense, crystallized, as opposed to they have a more subtle form, right? In which they're preconceptual, right? Maybe they have an emotional resonance, but not yet an object that can be identified, clearly in discursive or conceptual space. They have a yet even more subtle form. Well, we're going to talk about this when we talk about the subtle body next week. They have an even more subtle form where they can still be experienced even in the subject-object dichotomy, as a sort of subtle energetic movement, right? And then they have even a more subtle form that can be whose presence can be registered by consciousness, but beyond the subject-object dichotomy, okay? But nonetheless, the idea is that the prana then sort of wells up from the innermost space of consciousness and becomes increasingly dense, crystallizes into energetic movements that you experience in your body, and then eventually into thoughts and emotions, and then even eventually into your physical tissues themselves, okay? But here, what's represented by Patanjali's serpent hood is the expansive, rising, spreading pattern of apana, and the excitation of the mental functions that go along with that. Okay? But, and if you've ever, you've probably seen one of these images, and if you haven't, you're going to see one because I just mentioned it, and now there's a seed planted there, and you're going to see one very, very soon. But there's also he's in this image, he's sitting in what's obviously a sort of meditative posture. I mean, his face is totally relaxed, right? The eyes are either closed or half closed. There's a look of serenity on his face, and yet a vibrance that he's attending to something. And whatever he's attending to is enchanting. And yet it's not distracting him at all out of the present moment. Indeed, those cobra heads seem to form almost like an acoustic shell. He seems to be listening to all of the various voices, to all of the different possibilities for interpreting experience without allowing any one of them to distract him from the others. Are you with me? That's a very important point. He's listening to all of those internal voices without letting any one of them distract him from the others, which means, among other things, that he's not doing what you and I ordinarily do, which is select from among the different voices in our minds the voice that we recognize as me. I go, oh, that's what I think. I hear a voice and I go, yeah, that's me. That's what, right? I identify with that voice. And you hear another voice and you go, oh, no, that's what other people think. Right? So there's a function of mind called ahankara, which is continuously doing this. It's continuously building a conception of yourself, an image of yourself, using, all of these different sort of streams of experience, selecting from among them, deciding which of them are relevant, which of them, you can sort of integrate into your sort of conscious psyche, and which of them just need to be sort of pushed into the darkness, into the shadow, or discounted, as being part of the background noise of your experience, right? The mind is always doing that, except when it's not. And indeed, there's a part of the mind that's always conscious of all of those currents that's not doing that, the meditating part. We'll talk more about that next week again, but the idea is that Patanjali is immersed in that place of consciousness where he can listen to everything that's happening without being disturbed by any of it, right? Without even so much as delivering a continuous meta-commentary on what's being experienced so that he can go, oh yeah, that's what I think, but here's me. Well, here's me, looking at things that I think are not me, and yet I know better because they are actually me, and I'm doing a really good job. Like no measurement. But just allowing all of those psychical currents, those mental currents, those currents of thought to course through the space of consciousness unbound. Okay? What allows him to do that is his coiled serpent's tail, which is to say, the continuous activation of the aponic or dissolving force, the force that connects him to the ground, right? Which is the place, back to which all energy ultimately returns, right? Which in the subtle body is, associated, is often just called the heart, right? The sort of innermost core of one's being is also, what's represented by the earth is that. And it's our common ground. It's what we all share, okay? So he's connected to the dissolving energy of the earth, and just because he is, his space of consciousness is super wide. And things can just flow through it without obstruction. And he experiences none of it as threatening, none of it even as particularly exciting, but all of it as absolutely enchanting. Okay? That's what's represented by the image of Patanjali. And that's the mode of consciousness that we're cultivating in the practice of Hatha Yoga. And we do it on a very visceral way by working with the two energies that we feel cycling on our own breath. We feel the way the breath moves the body, the way that the inhale, there's a certain embodied pattern of the inhale that involves lifting the heart, spreading it, arching the back. A certain embodied form that goes with exhaling, which involves, flexing the spine, drawing down toward the heart, right? And what we do in something like Ashtanga Vinyasa, which is, fundamentally a breathing practice, is we extend those fluid movements of breathing, because breathing is, of course, an embodied process. What else could it be? And we explore in the space of embodiment, and this is profoundly important, the way that those two energies merge into one another, the way that they mutually support one another, right? And in that way, I hope you'll go with me here, we contemplate the way that the force of birth and the force of death, the movement of birth and the movement of death, are actually one continuous movement. And it's the movement of life. You know what I mean? And we're contemplating that in a deeply visceral, embodied way as we practice Hatha Yoga. Okay. Now, this, of course, is something that is this is something that somewhat goes against the grain of ordinary consciousness, right? And of the consciousness that is the sort of intersubjective consciousness that we sort of encourage in our culture and so forth, et cetera, right? Which tends to sort of seize on one particular moment, right? Let's call it the moment of creation, right? And so the celebration of the creative dimension of the movement of vital force, or the movement of life, the celebration of youth, the celebration of springtime, the celebration of falling in love, right? Right? As opposed to the process of dissolution, right? The process of the autumn, right? Of the impending winter, of dissolution, of decay, of death, etc. Right? There's something inside of us on account of which we sort of bear down against what is otherwise an extraordinarily sort of easeful and elegant process of the natural world moving, of the seasons turning into one another, of the ebbing and flowing tides swirling together, of stars imploding in the inky expanse of space to be reborn again somewhere else, of the way that a songbird can make a nest on a bending branch, even as the trunk of the tree deadens and hollows out, right? Precisely to make space for another creature to find its home. Right? But somehow, though we can appreciate the smoothness and the ease and the sort of overflowing elegance of that whole movement, that sort of cyclical movement of birth and death, when we think of it as being outside of ourselves, like when we think of nature as a sort of spectacle, right? Rather than as something that we're completely immersed in, right? We find it very difficult to recognize that movement in ourselves. And so we sort of bear down in a certain way, and we cling to our unique and individual forms as if we could somehow brace ourselves against the tide. And the teaching in so many contemplative traditions is that this is a source of profound suffering. And so when we bring our attention to the internal movement of the breath, in the mode of Hatha Yoga, and we align our consciousness with that sort of flowing movement, right? This is a radical reorientation of our consciousness, right? To the extent that we really give our awareness to that we give ourselves over to that experience of deep breathing, right? That we start to participate in something that is profoundly meaningful. We start to come closer in that way to the creative sources of our own being, rather than resisting its movement and clinging to certain emanations, to sort of part of its continuously dissolving scaffolding, right? Because the creative energy, the energy of Shakti, is not only continuously creating, but she's also continuously dissolving, right? So that it's of her very nature to be in continuous movement, right? To cycle, to flow and to move, okay? And indeed, if you guys are still with me, shall we go on a little bit more? Is it okay? Okay. I think it makes sense to say a little something more about the way that we embody that in Hatha Yoga. That might be interesting. That's not where I thought we were going to go, but here we are. We never go where I think we're going to go. I thought I was going to tell you about the burning of Sati, but maybe we'll do that another time. I do want to say this. I do want to tell you that the fundamental metaphor in Hatha Yoga, for Hatha Yoga, and what is Hatha Yoga? I don't mean the rituals of Hatha Yoga. I don't mean the practice of Hatha Yoga. But Hatha Yoga also refers to a sphere of consciousness, right? It refers to a consciousness, right? Whose fundamental metaphor is the erotic entanglement of Shiva and Shakti, or, if you like, the interpenetration of the masculine and feminine principles. And the masculine and feminine principles in this context are the principles of consciousness and creative energy, respectively. And it's said that those two principles, they have no hierarchical relationship. Because ultimately, they are inseparable from one another. Consciousness contains within it certain creative potentialities. And it manifests those potentialities in, through, and as the phenomenal world, which is to say, through you and me. And so through our experience, through our consciousness, through our senses, through our thoughts, consciousness revels in the spontaneous unfoldment of its own creative possibilities. Do you see? And in the mythological representation of the erotic entanglement of Shiva and Shakti, which is, again, it's the fundamental sort of cosmological metaphor for the entire world, actually, right? Because the entire world is a yoga. It's just that we don't experience it that way, right? But in the innermost sphere of consciousness, we'll talk more about this. I want to go deeply into this in our next session. But in that sort of innermost consciousness, the consciousness is just unfolding its creative potentials for the sake of knowing itself in that way, right? For the sake of creative expression, for the sake of experiencing itself, expressing its potentialities in ever new and unprecedented ways, right? Okay, so Ananta Shesha literally means, so Shesha literally means what's left over, or what spills over, what overflows and falls, what falls to the floor, right? Patanjali, falling from the hands. It's what can't be held. It's the sand or the ashes that fall through your hands when you can't quite hold it, right? And the idea is that it's of the nature of the creative principle to be inherently excessive. Excessive in the sense that she cannot be reduced to any idea that you might have about her. She's always more than that, right? Which is to say, of course, that she transcends any representation that you might have of her, any idea that you might have of her, any ritual that you might use to honor her, to worship her. There's always something more that is not captured by the concept, not captured by the ritual, not captured by this experience, right? And what more is it? It's always to be revealed, see? And I mean, one way I like to make this point, because I think it's quite vivid, is just look at the realm of biology, right? We know that life is continuously evolving. In the language of, contemporary genetics, it's because genes mutate. They mutate, according to the sort of standard story, they mutate randomly. And then they're selected somehow, by various evolutionary pressures, right? So that the forms of life that sort of emerge out of the, out of these, just this vast, pool of genetic reproduction, right, are the ones that sort of, answer in certain ways to the genetic pressures that they are. But what we know is that process is inherent to life. That without that, there wouldn't be life. If life wasn't constantly shifting shape and changing form, it never would have gotten off the ground. It never would have really started. That it can do that precisely because it's ever renewing. It's ever refreshing, right? It's said that Shakti is nityodita, ever arising, right? Ever in the process of becoming other than she just was, right? Now, as human beings, of course, we all manifest that same. We are emanations of Shakti's creative power. And we refer to this idea that we're sort of always in the process, that there's sort of always infinitely more to us than what is already revealed, by saying that human beings have depth, right? That they are windows onto the sacred, right? That there's something infinite. There's an infinite well of creative potential that's manifesting through every human being, right? And this is what makes them sacred. Right? So Shakti has this sort of excessive quality, that there's sort of there's always more. And what is sort of spilling over as the phenomenal realm is everything that, is the sort of creative outpouring of the inner yoga, of Shiva and Shakti, in their sort of amorous entanglement, or consciousness exploring its own creative potential, right? And so in a certain way, everything that spills over, namely you and me, is Shesha. It's what's left over, what comes forth. And so Ananta means infinite. And so Ananta Shesha is the infinite, he represents the sort of infinite overflowing of that is the phenomenal realm. And of course, when Ananta Shesha receives all of that knowledge from Shiva and Shakti, what he receives as knowledge, those words, are the Shesha of a certain inner experience. Knowledge is Shesha, right? Knowledge is sort of ex post facto, that which you sort of bring forward out of the experience. And say, well, here's the ritual, here's the chant, here's the practice that we'll do, right? That has to somehow be grounded in. If it's to have sap, if it's to have life, if it's to have vitality, the creative energy has to flow through it, right? And we know that sometimes it doesn't. And so Shesha can also mean, that in ritual context, Shesha literally refers to the charred remains of the sacrificial object. What's left over after you make the sacrificial offering, what Agni did not accept, right? What didn't burn cleanly in the fire, that's one of the original meanings of Shesha. It's the charred stuff. It's the ashes, right? And of course, those ashes can be seen as sacred. Shiva rubs them on his body, right? And he's the friend of the Shesha, which is why he has all the ganas sort of, around him. But in a certain context, and I wanted to tell you a big story about this, but I'm not going to do it. We just don't have enough time. But it's the story of the burning of Sati. But the point is that the ritual itself, Ananta Shesha, as the incarnation of Patanjali, brings the Shesha, the knowledge of the inner experience of yoga, out into the human realm, right? And then we take those practices, and we take the Hatha Yoga. We can take the Hatha Yoga. Of course, Hatha Yoga is not what's described in the classical yoga of Patanjali. It's a later development, as I explained, right? But we then, to embody those states of consciousness, right, We have to allow the sap, the life, to flow back through that. Right? We allow the life to flow through it. Right? And the way we do that is by allowing the breath, allowing the circular movements of energy in the body to cycle. Right? And they cycle in a particular kind of way, which I thought I was going to describe for you in detail. I always think I'm going to do way more than I end up doing because time just speeds along when we start talking about these things. But the energy cycles through the body in a distinctive kind of way, which of course Hatha Yoga, if you know anything about Hatha Yoga, you know that it describes particular movements of vital energy, which indeed have embryological precedence, can be, our physiology is an extrusion of that, a sort of condensation of the way that energy cycles internally. But what we try to do in Hatha Yoga is to allow those ascending currents that start to condense into our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our memories, to release their form, to curl, following the arc of the serpent's head, to curl overhead, and then return back toward the center of the heart. And when that energy returns back to the center of the heart, it's returning back to its ground. It's moving back toward that innermost sphere of being that is Shiva and Shakti and erotic entanglement. And it's said that the subtle body lights up with new vitality, with new creative energy. When the energy is allowed to cycle, when it's allowed to flow. But that involves, among other things, connecting to the dissolving force and allowing things to move, right? Rather than tensing around them and holding them in our bodies in all the many ways that we do, both physiologically and psychologically, which is still physiologically, it's just subtle physiologically. So we allow those things to move. We allow that energy to be absorbed back into the subtle body. That process is called Hatapeka, which means sudden absorption, sudden assimilation. It's the reassimilation of the energy, the creative energy, that crystallizes as our thoughts, our emotions, our memories, and all of the stuff that we think of as being outside of the sphere of our thoughts, emotions, and memories, and that yet still moves in the space of our consciousness. To let all of that move in the space of an open, compassionate awareness, an awareness that has no agenda, that has no self-image, and by the way, that's what Shiva represents. We'll talk more about that next time. But to move in a space, because see, Shiva has no creation story. He represents an awareness that's timeless, has no beginning and no end. And that awareness is the foundation of our awareness. Right? Our consciousness is just a sort of a splinter of that, if you like. Right? Perhaps a fragment. But if we allow ourselves to step out of that fragment, allow the edges of that fragment to dissolve, we find ourselves in wider and wider spaces. But only by letting go of this sort of constellation of entangled energies that we cling to out of a sense of sort of, nervous urgency. Right? As we let go of that, the energy can cycle more freely. It returns back to the subtle body. The subtle body lights up with new creative vitality. That's the Hatapeka, and that's what's represented by Anantashesha eating his own tail, which is the way Anantashesha is often represented. Right? This is how we embody the continuous fluid movement of birth and dissolution that is life. This is what it means, at least for us, for now, for our first pass. This is what it means to participate in Hatha Yoga.